Most of you probably know him, but our guest speaker today is Khonna Yudu Asal Kshingit Khinach, Eka Khinach Lance Twitchell Yudu Asal, Lukach Adich City, Ekhwaji Shkakwe Dachaka,
Oh,
uh,
hoogte T. Yeah.
um, Mufti Gudi.
Oh, okay. Huh.
So this is Dr. Lance Twitchell. He is named Khone and Shinget. He is Lukach Eti he was born in Skagway and Khuakitur City. He's a teacher. He was my teacher. And we had a discussion about a few topics. A few of you mentioned in the chat that you recognized some phrases. Oh, you're okay. So one of them I see in the chat is late for snow. And you saw the shoveling action, which I love. This is a big part of how I capture context and conversation, especially as a beginner, when I was a beginner. So let's do some of our phrases we heard late. What else did you all hear? You could put it in the chat. You can unmute your mics, raise your hands, whatever you're comfortable with.
Maybe Lance, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I heard you say Iguayakwan.
Yeah.
Awesome. Goodness cheese.
Kaidikog, notice love and kindness. So that's prediction. Pusta on. Hayashaga
Oh,
and Pusta kind.
you're speaking a Greater Northern dialect.
Northern dialect. Enough change. Okay, when they contributed in the chat, add these. Oops. So let's do repetition. Everyone for late, for the word for snow. Go ahead and unmute your mics and repeat after me. Late.
Late.
One more time. Late.
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 Okay. And then the next one, for have strength and courage, repeat after me. Iko ayakwan.
Iko ayakwan.
Yeah. So this last one, so we have a couple different types of X's right next to each other. The first one is an underlined X, and repeat after me. Yach.
Yeah.
It'll be in the back of your throat, nice and loose and gravelly. One more time. Yach.
Yach.
Yeah.
And then the next one is a pinched X that's going to happen up in the roof of your mouth. So repeat after me. Khwan.
Kwan.
For the whole line. Iko ayach khwan.
Du ayach kwan.
Next one for kindness. Repeat after me. Tusha on.
On.
And love. Husachan. That k again is an underlined K, so it'll be in the back of your throat. Kind of how you hear ravens say, "Kuk, kuk." It's kind of in that area. So repeat after me. Husachan.
Kwan.
Sechan.
And last one, we'll do this, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rene. This is a phrase. Repeat after me. Late. Oh wait, Clean late clean.
Should
Hey, can you repeat it this year? Can you say this one for them to repeat you?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna change the prefix to KU underline K and then get
Okay, I see it in here. Like that?
okay, sheesh. So this one is Klein Glate Kukahween.
Plain, great,
Oh,
queen.
So let's do the first word. The first word means many or lots, and it's Klein.
Clean,
Klein.
clean.
There's no high tones on it anywhere because there is a place in the interior called Klein, which is Big Lake, which is sometimes called Atlin if you don't speak Tlingit. And the word for snow, which is also the color white, which we did earlier, is glate.
Great.
And then the next one is a future verb for shoveling or spooning something out. And I had a different prefix on here at the beginning. If the word before it starts with a vowel, it will contract. So this is the uncontracted version. So like if you say the word cannot in English, there's a contracted version, can't. And if English had rules like Tlingit, we'd say cannot, but if something ended with a vowel before it, we would switch it to can't. So that's what happens. So I had it as kukwa earlier, but that's the contracted version. The original uncontracted version is kukha. And kukha, which is just the first part of this word, is the prefix of the verb. And kukha means I am going to. So then you've got huin, which is to shovel. So kukha-huin,
Queen.
kukha-huin,
Clean.
kukha-huin,
Queen.
kukha-huin.
Kukahwing.
Atlein glade kukha-huin.
Clean, great, kukahwing.
There you go. And that's your phrase for the month of March if you live in the Juneau area, because it's piling up on us.
Okay. Geez. Well, we're excited to have Khani here today. He has agreed to come and share with us for our Introduction to Dialect series. So far, we've had representation from Yakdad, from Dakka Tlingit or Inland Tlingit. Jeff Lear came and spoke about Tantaquan and Hinyaquan dialects. And so Khane is here to share with us about his work with a speaker from Cake and what he knows of the Cake dialect. So Khane, I'll hand it over to you. I'it Kwaha.
Oh, yakaya gonna cheese khat yach chate khatna u with clear gate clash yichruch aya khat wutien. Ye awak ko ach to a sagu at that you achtatani qich kwan a day aya you has outla atki ya one kanins chakut ye de chaye cooking chakut ye de awa you atutli atk ya shingit qinach ya chakuksa awa has ya has to khilk o has ya has to a sagu you has atla atkin ya uhansu hatu a sagu ya chakuksa awa yuhan ach to a sagu يخيلك هسيخ أيا يقكخيلا آتي يأوه يكقواتي آتلين أدخو أووش يختتي ياها يقتنجي تين أدي أوه يقدل أتكي يا قلت آقوه يا أخ هاي يقتنجي كنخوه يدتيخ أدي أوه يقتل أتكي قلت شيش خيتي سآخي Thank you for the invitation. Sorry I couldn't make it last time. And I'm always happy to talk about our language and things that are going on. Uh, the way that we talk is a little bit different depending on where you're at, but the difference is not a big, it's not a big difference. It's a little difference. Sometimes dialect becomes reasons to not learn from people or to not work with people. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think that's a divisive colonial mechanism that keeps us from, we don't work with Canadians, or we don't work with inlanders, or we don't work with, like, just all this other stuff that I think are these little poison pills designed to keep us from being united. But we're going to be united. We're going to be like a single thing. Those of us who are working in our language and who are learning and speaking and using it. I'm a big fan of safe learning environments, of just using the language, going for it. I'm not a big fan of stopping people from talking until they get it right. I think go ahead and get it wrong. I think there's actually no mistakes in language learning. It's all just language learning. So I encourage you to keep going, keep trying. Don't worry if it sounds uh, different or not quite there yet, because it's all a process, and you don't get there unless you actually do the thing. So like if you never rode a bike, if you told a kid, "Don't you ride that bike until you know how to ride the bike," like that would just not work, right? And so the kid's gonna have to go all over the place, fall down a couple times, and those things are gonna happen. But don't let anything stop you or slow you, and also try not to stop or slow anybody. Learning and using languages is surrounded with an awful lot of trauma, an awful lot of pain. And unfortunately, sometimes we turn that pain upon each other, and that we end up being the facilitators of trauma. And so we always got to just sort of operate from a place of love and kindness. And I talked a lot about respect, respecting, we have this term, shawodenegi, the self-respecting people. And so the self-respecters, that means they respect everything. Everything has a spirit, and so that means you give respect to everything. And that means, one of the things I talked about earlier when we were just having a conversation is sometimes in some cultures people could just say whatever they want and then do something totally different. But we never wrote stuff down, so we always had to live upon the words that we spoke. And so one of the I've been dealing with some shady characters lately. And so one of the phrases I was thinking of the other day is a liar can't really carefully track their own footprints. And so like speaking the truth and being what we call to be a true human being, I think it means you understand the values of our culture and you really live them. And a lot of that means like being respectful. And even if someone is, there are people out there who've got mean things to say about me and the way I teach and the way I talk. And I say, like, let them say those things. It's okay. Because I am like, what I really encourage you folks to get to a point is where you can meet someone who speaks Lingit and you start talking to them. And then they turn, when you leave, a day later, they say, hey, bring that person back who talks like an old person, right? Like that's your goal, right? But I also have a friend who's Chamorro, and so he's from Guam and he works in their language. And he says, I speak my grandmother's language, but I don't speak like my grandmother. And that's not saying like you can't or you shouldn't or you won't. That's just saying don't put so much pressure on yourself that you're not going to do it until you can do it like the ancient great ones, right? Like you can build yourself up, and we can help each other get there. And we're here to talk about dialects. So I think I'll start by giving you my perspective on dialects. I've done a lot of work in this area, and some people do get grumpy about the ways that it's being talked about, but it's okay. I think the biggest thing is respect the dialects as well. Like people have these different ways of talking. They are very important to them, and it's important that we maintain what we can. Uh, and this means like having a base that we teach from, which is usually right here. This Greater Northern Tlingit is usually what we're teaching. But if you're from a particular place, I would recommend learning what are the differences in dialect and what kind of adjustments can you make. And so there's a pretty big one that I'll talk about here in a second, but I don't want to zoom in on this. So here's Lingit Class. Like it's a single language. It's all one language. If you listen to recordings made 130 years ago, you can listen to them, and they're talking very similar to how we talk right now. So at the core of it, it's almost all exactly the same, right? And so it's not like someone's going to say something and you're going to have a real hard time understanding them, right? So you might have to listen kind of hard just to pick up some of the differences. And sometimes you will have a different word for the same thing. Like anybody know what atkhashtitil is? Atkhashtitil. Anybody know that word? Atkhashtitil.
Is that moccasins?
It's moccasins. And if you were an old timer from Yakutat, you might call it keish teeth. And so sometimes you have a totally different word for the same thing. And so that can be a little bit tricky. And sometimes you have these things that you borrow from English in different ways. So I heard from an elder in Yakutat that when she was young, the elders would say, Tiki wak nachtuat. And so that's a tiki wak nachtuat. And the first part is not a Tlingit word, tiki wak. The second word means let's go, walking. But what do you think the first part comes from? Tiki wak.
I've heard this one before, so I'm not going to say.
Give me one guess. Just give me one guess.
Hawaii.
No, it's not from Hawaii. But it sounds like kind of Hawaiian, like tiki wak, like a tiki torch or something. Let me check the chat real quick. Yes, it comes from take a walk. So take a walk, let's go, right? So let's go take a walk, right? So it's very cute, like, and so incorporating English. And so Tlingit borrows from English, and Tlingit has forever borrowed from other languages. So there's a word, nakatse, that's not a Tlingit word. That's a borrowed word from another neighboring language. It's our word for a fox. And there's a reason Haida has nakatsi. And then watsik is a word for caribou. That's also not a Tlingit word. So we have a number of words that we borrow from neighboring languages, and we always have. It's not a big deal. And so we do this quite a bit. So when we look at the dialects, for me, it comes down to these four major differences. And what I would call them is Tanta in Tlingit, or Tungis, Ichki, or Southern, a Dagige in the middle, and Naki, Northern. So for me, the big difference is A vowels and E vowels. So if you look at our vowel chart here, Tlingit does have 4 vowels, and each of those vowels has 4 options. So it's like there's the A vowels, E vowels, I vowels, U vowels, but they're a set. And they are a set because sometimes it will go from to to ah, right? So for example, if I want to say eat it, cha, that's this vowel. That's a command form for eat it. If I want to say I didn't eat it, tlechwacha, so that's this one. And if I said I did eat it, chwacha, it's this one. So that vowel in the what we call the verb stem is changing. It's going from short and high to long and low to long and high. So you will have that, and sometimes you'll have vowel jumping, like the word cheo is sand, the word dak is inland, the word at is a thing. But when you put those 3 words together, you get dakawedi. So you go dak, cha, we, di. And so you have, cheo. When cheo contracts, it sometimes becomes chao, which means you got to be very careful with how you say it, because there's another word that sounds something like that. And so, but for dialects, when it comes to dialects, the big difference is between these E vowels and these I vowels. So there's a lot of switching that takes place, and it's just fine to go yan uwane. Oh, it's right here. Yan uwane and yan uwani. That's the biggest difference, I think, in dialect. Some are going to be the A vowel, some are going to be the E vowel. Not every time. And I don't know if we've really taken a close look and documented all the situations where they change. but that's the biggest one. Is sometimes it's going to be an A for northern, and it'll be an E for southern, cake, transitional, or the in-between, and also for Tessin and Carcross. So when we go back to this, so looking at this, the biggest difference here is probably the vowels, right? When we go into Southern Tlingit, we also have, like a verb has two main parts. It has a stem and a prefix. In the stem, you have the verb root, which has meaning. Like if we went back to the verb that we were just using, well, I can't remember what verb we're using. But if we say like goot, that means to go, to walk, right? So goot is the root. But then the stem is saying, is it gut, goot, goot? So the stem says, what's the vowel doing? The prefix contains there's a whole bunch of information packed in there. Who's doing it? Who's it happening to? Are there any sort of, is it moving around to like, did happen, didn't happen, will happen, won't happen, will happen, won't happen? You know, those types of things. Those are all going to happen, and the prefix is going to start changing quite a bit. One of the things with Southern Tlingit is they are more likely to drop a vowel in the prefix. So a vowel can fall out in the prefix, which we kind of just talked about earlier. So for example, when I was putting some text in there for shoveling, I said, so you have kukha, which is I am going to, and sometimes that becomes kukwa. So this U vowel fell out, right? So sometimes vowels will fall out. These are things that happen. It's very predictable, but there's a lot of moving parts. So Southern Tlingit is sometimes more likely to drop vowels. And for Northern Tlingit, and for also what we call this in the middle, there's certain things, like if you have a classifier that goes DLI. So you might say, or let's do DSI, right? So you might say, Wududzachan. You can say, Chatidzachan, I am loved. So this Z is the classifier. And that letter I means that the verb happened or became that way. So we cannot drop that letter I in Northern Tlingit. If you try to drop that letter I for Northern Tlingit, like the grammar would say, no, you cannot do that. That's bad. But for Southern Tlingit, they can, and it'll go to a TS. Like that can be a single classifier. And if you haven't talked about classifiers yet, they're very important parts of Tlingit, but you don't have to know everything about it in order to speak the language. But if you want to know how the grammar works, you're going to have to get into the ring and wrestle with this classifier. It's very fun. It's like that little man who wear a Blackbeard cape. You'll defeat him at some point. So these are the big differences with dialect. When you go inland, so right here, Deslin, Natasayini, Jilchat. So in Teslin and Carcross and Cluckwan, you also get one additional change. Well, I think you get two. The two additional changes you get is the letter M and the vowel O. So let's start with the easier one. So when there's controversy about how to write this vowel, my recommendation is to put an underline on it, which is a little bit tricky. But the reason I would say put an underline on it is like, let's take a look at a word. Let me type it on here. So the word that we're going to look at is pook. Can anybody tell me, whoops, oh, where'd it go? Whoops. What does this word translate to? Does anybody know the word pook? Skinyatla.
Box.
It is a box, yes. And so if you see this underline here, let me actually try and make this a little bigger. So the underline is right here. So if you have an underlined K, G, or X on either side of this vowel, when you are dealing with the inland dialect, you will end up with a vowel shift. And so what this will become, let's see, how do I want to do this? So instead of kook, you would say coke, almost like Coca-Cola, right? So that like that O sound, O, does not exist outside of Teslin, Carcross, and Cluckwan. Not a whole lot, except for the word ho ho, right? Which you'll hear people say, goodness cheese, ho ho. Or one time I saw Walter Sobolov, one of the last speeches I ever saw him give. He stood up and he did it 4 times. Before he said anything, he did this 4 times. Ho ho, ho ho, ho ho, ho ho. And by the second time, in my brain, I was like, this is really important. What he's going to say is going to be really important. So you get a bonus vowel if you're an inland speaker. And so you hear them say yanakoch. It's very slight. It's very slight. But that's why, no offense to anybody else's language, but when they heard of the community of Tok, they thought it was kind of funny because we would say tuk for a butt, for a person's butt, and they would say tok. And so that's one of the dialect things is this vowel switch. The other one, which is a little bit perhaps trickier, is when we go and we're sort of looking at this kind of stuff. If we end up with a vowel in the prefix, if we end up with a vowel and a consonant and vowel in the classifier, and in between them you have this perfective marker, which then turns to a W, then this will become an M. So for example, if you have Audigan, what you have here, there's a vowel, there's the W, there's a consonant and vowel in the classifier. So this one will switch to Umdigan. And so this, but it's predictable. That part is predictable. What's not as predictable when you deal with speakers who are speaking inland Tlingit is when it does it in a noun. So like Gumdan is a horse, and then sometimes Gam is a drum. And so this comes down to probably a lot of it. Let's see, where's my little alphabet chart? There's probably one other sound to talk about before we listen to Cajuan Ish in the Cake dialect. Is this one right here. So this guy, which I like to call Shewaki Y, is which would mean the letter Y with eyes, is a sound that does not really exist outside of Teslin. Maybe a couple of Carcross speakers and maybe 1 or 2 Cluckwan speakers. But this used to be in all Tlingit. It's kind of a Y that comes through the nose. It's like a Y sound meets an NG sound. So if you said Tlawake Y, and using this, you'd say Tlawake Nyang. So it's got a sound. It still exists. They still use this sound in Teslin. So they might say, with Northern Tlingit, you might say, gonna cheese hat ye di, right? And if you're gonna say that, oops, let's see, where am I gonna put this? Sorry. If you're gonna say this, ye di, so that you all came here, it's really important to get the second Y. Because if you don't, you're gonna say gonna cheese hat ye di. You say it too fast, you lose that. Gonna cheese hat ye di. You just get this little, there's a little ripple in there. But if you were from Teslin, you'd say gonna cheese hat ying di, and you would hear that an NG. It almost sounds like this, gonna cheese hat ying di, but it's very subtle. So that's a sound that still exists. There are a number of nouns that had this sound in it. For example, long time ago, people would probably say dunyati, right? And then that transitioned over time to duwadi, but then most people nowadays would say duyadi. So what happens is a U vowel, which is called a rounded vowel, because to make that sound oo or oo, you'll notice your lips have to come forward, oo. So if your lips come forward, it will often convert this sound into a W because you're already there anyways. Wah, 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 yeah, 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 woo, yeah, woo, yeah. So it's like lips forward, lips back, lips forward, lips back. So when it comes to cake, for the people of cake, oops, I'm on the wrong one. Where'd I go? So for the people of cake, they fall under this dialect in the middle. So they are going to use, so even the name of the village, northern people would say cake with the EI, but people from cake would say cake. So on the map in English, I think it should be keek. If we're going to sort of say, let's do a mispronunciation, let's at least respect the dialect that's from there. Although someday we should just go ahead and say keek. So that gets us to, before I run out of time, Kakwan Ish, George Davis. Kakwan Ish, George Davis was Takdain Tan. He was a speaker who was born in the Huna area. His clan comes from the Huna area. But as a speaker, he grew up in Cake. So his father was Sagwedi, and he learned to speak like the Cake people. He told me he knew how to speak Tlingit really, really well. Well, he didn't say he spoke it really well, but he said the reason why he could speak the way he did was because he used to go fishing a lot, and fishing was his career at one point, and he would always get extra fish and bring it to the old people, and then they would talk to him. And so he learned how to talk from the elders who were in Cake. He was born in the early 1920s, so when they were elderly, those were people born in the mid 1800s, which means he talked to people and grew up with people who were born before Cake was bombed by the US Navy, probably. So this is a short story. It's about 5 minutes long. It is about a kushtaka, so get yourself ready, and then we'll talk about what kinds of things you hear after we watch it.
Yakuklikat has to say, where who's to say, kak to shut. Has has natiji, our sagan a bit. Our has kuya, were couple. Talk on the new, you know, talk on the new. The Tsikhani Adoka Yati. Triadic Rakulik Stone Katus Nuxnut. Was a shay has to cover the shutter shot, what do you car shut? Triad has to Sisa Hidi has a Jewanaka baby. The who are shit in your baby. My goodness, if got to 5 minutes, anak akakudi kun stone ke katu snuk swap kayati ye at katsko sati ako hasta atawa place at kusti where has to baby yekwa kuchach asu nature the kadyaki kao atasuku atas kushi nuch asatuka has kusaksnach katakachi the kuko ye awaka place Hekigach to satin. It's okay, gach to te. Chatra. Clean dance na to snene to be pure. Aqatsayekaqtussatiin aayati. Awahin qaasitaitas uaqortla. Nadaqassakaudi jail. Hasudishut. Aqautaq quneas quashi. Aqaus ase has asewa ahue at katsko. Each kadek taqach. Kandliji at the Canada kin. Seagulls and all kinds of birds. The Canada kin. To a kadelk taqach. A Khannakan has or a Koko has to yeti. The each cat satan. To chic. To kushtaya ayach yati to. If they ever straighten that little baby's arm like the human being. Achannachian has kuch da so kakukachko kakutuchant ishkak we baby chan. Awe aga oye kuyakeknich kushtaka yeke awe the spirit of the land otter man. Yeah, a Kauslinik Johnny Jackson. Kushtaka yeke awe the spirit. The chantishkak. Hetrach are they use a Kausli true a baby. But it actually happened. Clahas as kona ye talk on inu. Adachat het goes to yeti. Yeah, na kaus. Chukai yet was store het kudach wasako.
So I worked with him a lot. He's one of my main teachers, probably from 2014 until 2000, maybe 17 or 18. He was in his late 80s when I first started working with him, and then his early 90s when he started to get a little bit too tired. And Shakshani, Marge Dedson, was his relative, and the three of us worked together on lots of stuff, coming up with methods to teach Lingit. One of those methods was to go through and just start changing a whole bunch of pronouns. It's a very mechanical way to learn a language, but sometimes you got to do this artificial mechanical approach. So you could say, I love you all, I love them all, we love you, right? And you're just switching, so you're building these patterns up in your mind. But then you go in and you engage in whole language, and they were very fun to talk to. They were so fun. They were very, very religious, and so sometimes they didn't like particular topics, but he was really good with his Kushtaka stories and other things. And he would talk about stuff that sometimes Marge was a little uncomfortable talking about. And the Kushtaka is something that some people do get uncomfortable with. The brief version of the translation is there was a young couple. He forgot what their names were. He says that at the beginning. And they had a baby. And people really love babies. But for some reason, they had to go do something, and they left the baby in their tent. And they weren't gone for very long at all. but when they came back, they couldn't find the baby, and they're looking all over the place, and they're starting to get worried. And then when they realize, and he says, we're not gonna see it, we're not gonna find it. She started to cry, and then the man, he thought, well, there's like a waterfall over there, so let's go. We got to cleanse ourselves. You got to be pure if you're gonna find something. And so I think it's people have a big thing about like being pure for if you're gonna go do something difficult, you would bathe in the icy waters, and if you're gonna go fight somebody, you go bathe first. And if you're gonna engage in some sort of ceremony, and it's a ceremony to bring someone back from the kushaka. And so they cleansed themselves and they went out looking, and then they heard it crying on this reef. And there are a whole bunch of different types of birds hovering over this reef. So they went over there, and when they went, all the birds took off, and they saw their baby was there crying, and it had curled up little arms that were furry like a land otter. So it had land otter arms. It was being worked on, and they were transitioning it over to a land otter. And so they got to it in time. He says he never heard whether or not they straightened out its arms. But when all the birds left, there was just one that stayed behind. It's this little one called kak, which is a very important bird in Tlingit culture. It actually has many names. I've heard the name kak. He calls it kushtaka yegi, which would be the land otter spirit helper. Askatuyik hechwa. I heard that name from Lingit Class, Irene Cadiente, which is magic in the woods. And then its other name that it's known by is Askatuqaqi, which is apparently what it says. Sometimes if you're in the woods and you hear it talk, it'll say, you all sit down in the woods. That's what it says. And so it has these 4 names. It's a very, very powerful, it's a little owl with, well, I don't know how big it is, but it doesn't have the tufts. So it's that little owl. I think it's called a boreal owl in English. And there was some confusion because people would call it a hawk or a hawk owl. But I talked to George quite a bit about getting these names correctly, and I believe it is that little owl. And so when you listen to him, there's lots of things that he says qi for obey, where Northern Tlingit would say qi. So there's that E to the A sound. But there's one additional vowel switch that I want to talk about before we go. So this one is a little bit less predictable, but we have a verb root, shuk, which means, and this is where we get electricity from. Our word for electricity is kashuk. It comes from this verb, but it actually means for cramps. Like if you have a muscle cramp, or if you are female and you go through your moon cycle, you might have cramps. And so those cramps could also be, this would be the word you could use for that. But so if you see this word SHOOK apostrophe, there's a couple things. One is if you look in this database and it marks the verb root as high, so you see that high tone, that means it will not go low. So just keep that in mind as you start to learn how stems work and how vowels change. But for this, they would have, from cake, it would go SHEEK apostrophe W. So for this one, it'd say chet kautle shuk. I got an electric shock, or I got cramps. They would say chet kautle shiko. So it would switch to a high tone letter I. And another one that makes that switch would be this one. So to touch something, so this is nuke, N-O-O-K. For them, it would be N-E-E-K-W. So for example, they'd say G out the nuke, and they would say G out the neek with a KW at the end. So that's the last thing I could think of as far as a dialect goes. So when folks are from Qir, we try to encourage them to study this and say, for me, the most important thing about dialect is to say it is a lot easier to learn Tlingit and to learn your dialect than to try and be stubborn and say, I'll wait until someone teaches me through my dialect, because that's just an excuse to not learn the language. And so don't let the dialect stop you. And also don't make fun of anybody's dialect. Don't laugh about the ways that they say things. I mean, there's sometimes we'll make some light jokes, like when I was there and someone says, "Ye Jim Tune," and I was like, "Hey, what went inside of Jim? What are we doing?" You know, and so it's something, but not making fun of the way they talk, just sort of trying to crack a light joke about some stuff. And so, but then if you're teaching somewhere, like I've been blessed and I've had the opportunity to teach in Carcross and to teach in Teslin, and I'm hoping to go to Cake this spring and summer to teach them there, and to just be able to say, well, this is how you'd say it from here. This is how you'd say it if you're from here. And so to be able to work with folks to get them to honor their dialect and to hold on to it has been a lot of fun. Ikecha, any questions or comments in the last 3 minutes?
Shaksani kik hatu a gut. Ik exitini shaksani kik.
Jeez.
Kaktu.
Oh, what is your definition of a dialect?
For me, I would say there's languages, there's dialects, and then there's regional differences. So for me, the dialect means there's something you could say, okay, in this case, it switches to that. So it's something that you can clearly identify and you can write out what the pattern is, right? So for example, if you go to Boston, you just drop the R, right? So that is a dialect, right? But a regional difference would be, it's a little bit more slight and unpredictable. Like, so when I went to school in Minneapolis and people would talk about the sports teams that say, we won them last night. I was like, you didn't beat them? You won them? Okay. But that's just a regional thing because it's harder to predict. And so you do have that in Tlingit as well, where like in some regions they'll just say things a little bit differently, but it's harder to predict. For dialect, it's sort of like this vowel becomes that, this W becomes M. And for me, it's a predictable thing, and it has to do with how the language has grown in a particular place.
Goodness, geez.
Thoughts or questions? Anything else?
Goodness, geez, ha'iat katu, ha'atwusku. You know, I visited New Mexico one time long ago, like 97 or something. I got to hear some of the Navajo and the Apache dialect, and it really mirrored and reminded me of a little bit of home because when my grandmother would teach Tlingit to us when we were younger, we had a parent-child class we go to every Thursday night. One part would be, I'm assuming Southern or Tonka. I didn't quite pick up a lot of it, but the other part would be Naki Kwan style or Northern style because my father's father was from Kwekwan. And so what she said was, I know your way of talking as well. So to do two parts of it, but it's always amazing when I could hear people with two different dialects understand each other. And Gunesh Chish, so what the teachers are teaching us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and we all go back to one single language, probably 20,000 years ago, probably in the southwestern United States. And so, yeah, I remember I was visiting a Navajo family and they'd said Haku. And I was like, oh, we say Haku. You're my long lost relatives. And so it was so much fun to share that stuff. And if you learn Tlingit, you could probably go learn Navajo. Like it would be difficult, but it would be easier to learn Navajo than to learn a language outside of our realm. And so there are advantages to working together, whether we're talking about Shoshone peoples or Dena'ina or Koyukon. Like we all have this similar origin. We're going to have similar patterns. But Tlingit broke off from that language group so long ago and in such a different way that there's no other language we could talk to, except for maybe we could say rabbit, you know, just bring the rabbit over, but the rest of all the grammar would have to let go of. So it's really important to keep it going, and it's fun to share the similarities. We had some Navajo youth who were up here years ago and we're doing a community workshop, and they said, "Oh yeah, we got that. We just did it this way," and it was so neat. These kids could learn it in a week. I bet, you know, it was just so fun to like see how much that they could pick up on.
Goodness, geez.
Yeah, I noticed that around and this area, there's like I think Athabascan where they say Ninan na, like say the way we say na, meaning people.
Yeah, what?
Tana na,
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
At na. I think what is the name of that hot springs? China.
Gina, oh, yeah. I got married near there. I shouldn't forget.
That belongs to whoever she is.
Yeah,
So, yeah, I kind of have fun going through those, picking them out and realizing that the base of our language is still really similar in lots of ways.
yeah, what? Gonna teach train, yeah, ach art train section kik. Wasa ach ya koti wune, ya ade awe kai yishil tu ya Yesu. Chatsu ach tuasa gwgwll llacheit llach gi ka kwati I kataguyach aya yak kwatlaki ach tuasa gu. Tuqa ka kwasha tu yach. Gonna teach wasa ach tu kliki kach. Gonna teach ha.
On the 12th of this month, I'm going to be 91.
Nikechawi.
Okay.
Ate akandakit.
Ah.
Okay, gwnaf ti sa un cini gewa cich da chi fatangidad. Ha tu yw ei saw tu a chi pwnnach o gwnne gwnaf ti ha I dill tu llingid yw fatangi.
Nikecha. Galchish Johan. Galchish. Kakki ak. Ayak gidlak.
Ah, yw ei?
It's happy goody.
Ah, nikecha.
Because you cook to na hoyu. You got to a tank.
Ah, oh. Okay, galchish Johan. Sehr klasse.
Di cwestiwn.
Gwnaftis
Gwnaf ti.
iake ich chwestytyn.
Ah, nikecha.